Hello, I am Lisa Bear from Jackson County Library Services. I work in adult services at the Medford branch. And this event today is one of a series that is organized by JCLS and the OSU Extension Office Program for Master Gardeners, of which Scott is one of them, one of the Master Gardeners. So make sure I got everything here. I have one thing to share with you before we get rolling, and it is the Jackson County Library Services Land Acknowledgement. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Takelma, and Lagawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. And the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. All right, so I'm going to hand you over to Scott Goode, who's going to, a master gardener, who's going to be talking about composting here.
Okie doke. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. So this is a presentation on the various methods of composting that, here, I'm going to turn off my camera for just a second here. Okay. This is a presentation on the various methods of composting that allow you to find your role in the nutrient cycling aspect of the systems that generate and maintain a healthy soil. Oh, geez. Okay. So let's look at what composes a healthy soil. What first comes to mind when we think of a soil are the mineral components, the sand, silt, and clay particles that make up the bulk of the soil. These particles provide the matrix that plant roots and soil organisms depend on for support and habitat. Many of these organisms live on the surfaces of these particles and derive their nutrients from them. Eventually, these organisms make those nutrients available to plant roots and other organisms living in the soil, and making them an important part of the nutrient cycling process. An even larger volume of the soil is composed of the open spaces between these particles. This is a space where soil moisture and its dissolved nutrients, what we call the soil solution, along with larger organisms like earthworms and their allies, reside. In a healthy soil, this makes up nearly half of the soil volume. But the part of the soil that really counts toward a healthy soil are the organic matter, organisms, and plant roots that are living in the soil. These organisms generate the humus that is derived from the leftovers of what they consume, along with the decomposed plant and animal debris that they leave behind in the soil. Composting provides us an opportunity to become one of those organisms. These organisms compose an interacting system that soil microbiologist Dr. Elaine Ingham called the soil food web. This web cycles life and nutrients in a continuous flow, bringing energy from sunlight along with carbon dioxide from above the ground into the soil below. This influx, along with the nutrients from soil minerals below, feeds a living network that, over time, builds an ever richer and ever deeper healthy soil. This web is composed of a system of specialized ecosystems, each with a role in supporting the soil food web. These spheres are specialized habitats that fill or cover every part of the pie chart that we looked at earlier, right down to the mineral aggregates of sand, silt, and clay. This is what soil biologists call the aggregatosphere, shown in this diagram. In a healthy soil, these mineral particles are covered with bacteria and fungi that derive their nutrients by dissolving the mineral grains and releasing the nutrients and micronutrients that they contain into the surrounding soil. Surrounding these aggregates lies the porosphere, the open pores that we saw in the pie chart. The soil solution flows into these pores, carrying nutrients from the surface as water percolates into the soil. A host of organisms inhabit these pores, ranging in size from arthropods like beetles to microscopic amoeba that graze on the bacteria growing on the mineral grains that form the walls of these pores. In this way, nutrients liberated from the aggregatosphere mix with the soil solution, which circulates into the surrounding soil. In this way, these pores act like our microbiome, carrying nutrients out of our digestive system and out into our bodies. The roots that live in the porosphere have colonies of organisms that surround them. Plants share up to 50% of the nutrients they derive from the sunlight and atmosphere above down into their roots to feed these organisms that they host in the soil around them. In exchange for the nutrients the plant releases into the soil, some of these organisms that thrive on these nutrients reciprocate by providing soil-borne nutrients back to the plant. Still others protect the plant from pests and pathogens. This is why plants in a healthy soil don't need pesticides or amendments. As the plant's roots grow, they dramatically change the biology of the soil that surrounds them. This, in turn, changes the structure and chemistry of this region of the soil, generating that rhizosphere. Connecting even the deepest layers in the soil with the surface is the drillosphere. Though dozens of different organisms call the drillosphere home, the most prominent are the three very different types of earthworms that roam this habitat. Epigeic worms never venture below the surface of the soil, living in the duff or mulch that covers a healthy soil. Beneath them are the endogeic worms that live just below the surface, and they keep a healthy soil soft and fluffy, fighting any compaction that might occur. And finally, the anessic worms, the largest of the bunch, carry nutrients from the deepest layers in the soil all the way to the surface. And once at the surface, they generate middens of worm castings that are the sign of a healthy, productive soil. And finally, from the surface of the soil down to an inch or two below is the detritosphere. This is where we fit in. The detritosphere is the component of this system responsible for moving nutrients from plant and animal debris on the surface down into the soil below. In healthy soil systems, nearly all the nutrients invested in the plants and animals living above return to the soil food web below. These nutrients include carbon and oxygen and moisture that plants absorb from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and compose much of the humus and soil organic matter that's the hallmark of a healthy soil. In natural systems, a thick layer of ground cover and the rich and diverse population of the organisms living in it, this detritosphere, is very efficient at delivering nutrients down into the soil below. Unfortunately, cultivating, compaction, and especially tilling the soils diminishes or even completely removes this layer and the organisms living in it. Traditionally, one way to mitigate the effects of compaction, cultivation, and tillage has been the addition of compost as a part of good soil management. In looking at the various kinds of compost we'll look at, we'll see that not all composting systems are equal when it comes to replacing the detritosphere, and certainly not equal in the time and energy that they require. These are the types of composting that we'll explore in this presentation. We will look at what's involved in each and what results you can expect from each one of them. We begin with thermophilic or hot pile composting. This is a system that's been very popular in sites that generate animal manures. It provided an effective way of dealing with the waste product that could easily create problems with the pathogens they carried and the water quality issues created by the drainage from their accumulation. This is because hot pile composting can utilize the high nitrogen and phosphorus contents of manure that might otherwise create problems in surface and groundwater contamination. Now, most of the nitrogen and some of the carbon and moisture that go into a hot pile are given off in the steam that's a sign of an active hot pile composting. Managing hot compost requires tracking the temperature well inside the pile. This compost thermometer is 20 inches long, so you can check the temperature inside the pile without too much disturbance. Without one of these, you introduce a lot of guesswork into managing a hot pile. If manures are not part of the input into a hot pile, then other nitrogen-rich sources, what we often call green compost components, can be used. These would include fresh grass clippings, vegetable wastes from garden or kitchen, alfalfa pellets, and if cover crops like fava beans or vetch or field peas or winter peas are grown to keep the rhizosphere thriving and adding nitrogen to the soil, these make great sources of green material. The other ingredient for a hot pile is called brown material or carbon-rich material. This can be cereal straw, such as wheat or barley straw, dried leaves, corn stalks, even small sticks. Never use grass hay in a compost pile. It's usually filled with weed and grass seeds that will likely show up in the spaces where you spread the compost. A ratio of 3 parts brown to 1 part green material by weight puts the carbon to nitrogen ratio of these inputs at around the optimum of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Never put meat or dairy materials into any compost pile, as they'll draw rodents and other pests and slow down the composting process. The nitrogen-rich green materials are the fuel that feeds the compost process. This graph shows that the less green material, that is, the larger the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the mix that goes into building the pile, the cooler the maximum temperature and the shorter the duration of active composting will be. This shorter duration can result in a lot of only partially composted materials that are left over when the pile finally cools down. This partially composted material will have to be sifted out and added to the next compost pile to finish its decomposition. A feature of hot piles is the need to keep oxygen level in the compost pile at just the right level. This is accomplished by turning the pile periodically, and this is where the compost thermometer comes in. As the oxygen is used up by the microbes in the pile, the temperature in the pile will drop from 120 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the materials that are being composted, down to around 110 degrees Fahrenheit or less. At that point, the compost needs to be thoroughly turned to reintroduce oxygen into the mix. Monitoring the temperature and turning the pile continues until the pile remains at less than 110 degrees Fahrenheit following turning. Once this happens, let the pile rest until it gets down to ambient temperature. At this point, the compost should look like brown, crumbly soil with no sign of woody debris or other partially decomposed material. Again, any chunky material that does remain should be sifted out and added as brown material to the next batch of compost. Getting the right carbon to nitrogen ratio is the trickiest part of hot pile composting. And there are lots of charts out there available that can help you sort this out. There are some online calculators that can help you to get started, but with practice, finding the right balance of green and brown material can be intuitive. Without a doubt, hot pile composting is the most complicated and labor-intensive method of composting. These are some of the recommendations for safe and effective hot pile composts. The most important of these is making sure that if you use manure in the pile, that it gets to over 131 degrees Fahrenheit and stays above that temperature for at least 3 days. This ensures that any pathogens that might be in the manure are killed by the end of the composting process. If your pile doesn't get up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the first 5 days, you either don't have enough nitrogen-rich green material in the mix, or you might have too much moisture in the pile. These are the things that hot pile compost can provide. Most of the nitrogen in the materials that go into the pile is consumed by microbes that carry out the decomposition. The other nutrients that are in the material that went into the pile will be in the finished compost and in a form that makes them readily available to plants. If a pile doesn't get too hot, it can provide a host of beneficial microbes, and as long as the compost makes it into the soil before it dries out or gets too cold, it'll carry these microbes into the soil. Next, we'll look at cold pile composting, which is much easier to manage, but takes longer to produce a finished product. Because much of the decomposition in a cold pile is carried out by fungi, it should not be turned or disturbed. Any disturbance will break up the strands of hyphae that support the fungi, and they will have to regrow these strands to complete their work. This style of composting mimics the process that occurs on a forest floor. The finer the materials that go into the pile, the faster they decompose. And the carbon to nitrogen ratio is much less critical than it is for a hot pile. Putting kitchen or garden waste into a cold pile can attract rodents and other pests to the pile because they take much longer to decompose than in a hot pile. Manures should never go into a cold pile, as the pathogens that they might contain could make it into your cropping beds. There's some great information on the internet regarding this Johnson-Su cold composting system. It utilizes woody materials exclusively, and these systems are fairly easy to build. The developers of this system recommend that it takes about 18 months for the compost in these systems to fully mature. The resulting compost, and especially the compost teas that can be made fairly easily from it, can have dramatic results in crop production, nutrient availability, and improved soil biology. Looking for information on the Johnson-Su bioreactor will give you the information you need to build one of these systems, along with the details on the benefits of the resulting products. Compost teas have become a hot topic in composting. This is Dr. Elaine Ingram, shown here, has an entire certification curriculum based on generating and using compost teas. This is a fairly involved technique, and there are lots of websites and online instructions on the subject. So if you want more information or detailed information on this, you can find it online. Generating compost tea involves an apparatus like the one shown here. in which compost is added to water in this brewer. Air is pumped into the brewer, and after carefully controlled warming and agitation and time, the mix results in a variety of products used for both soil and foliar applications. These products are used for both nutrient addition and pest management. Once again, the internet provides lots of information on purchasing, building, and operating these brewers. Bokashi is another technique that's gotten a lot of attention. This is a book by Adam Footer, and it's one of several that can guide you in the background and application of this technique. This method was developed in the late 70s and early 80s by this gentleman, Dr. Turo Higa from Okinawa, and its system is rooted in the Asian fermentation methods like Korean natural farming tradition. Because it uses fermentation, the microbes that it depends on include facultative anaerobes that do best in environments with limited exposure to oxygen. This set of buckets pictured here provide the vessel in which composting occurs. Food scraps, which reportedly can include meat and dairy, are placed in the inner bucket along with a Bokashi inoculant that's available in some local stores and is produced locally by Southern Oregon Bokashi. This process is temperature sensitive and takes some practice, especially if meat and dairy waste are part of the mix. The resulting compost should be added to other compost and not directly to the soil. The hose bib on the side of the bucket is used to keep liquids from accumulating in the outer bucket, which is important in keeping the inner bucket from becoming anaerobic and stinky. Great care needs to be taken when the hose bib is opened. It should be done where it's good ventilation, and the drain material should be poured into a compost pile. Now, I found that when I added this Bokashi inoculant to the bedding in my goat barn, it eliminated the odors in the barn and dramatically extended the time between cleaning the barn. Next, we'll look at hugelkultur, which is a great way of converting woody material into deep, rich soil. We've used hugelkultur to turn low-lying, poorly drained areas into productive land. Excess moisture in the wet season absorbed by the woody material and stored there well into summer. This moisture helps decompose the wood, turning it into soil with a remarkable amount of organic matter. Since each increase of 1% organic matter in the soil increases the moisture holding capacity of that soil by 25,000 gallons per acre, the soils generated by hugelkultur berms have incredible moisture holding capacity and are rich in nutrients. Over time, these berms decrease between 20 and 30% in volume, leaving behind berms that increase the plantable surface of a site by about 20%. Because biochar can have significant environmental impacts and release up to 50% of its carbon into the atmosphere, hugelkultur provides a way of moving more of the carbon and nutrients in woody material safely and deeply into the soil. Using earthworms to decompose kitchen and crop waste can be a way of composting in the comfort of your own home or on a site that has limited yard space. Worm castings or vermicompost is one of the best compost materials available. It has unparalleled nutrient availability for plants and is full of beneficial organisms. The key to successful vermiculture is in having the right worms to begin with. These are those epigeic worms that live exclusively on the surface of the soil, in the duff that covers the soil. This is the detritosphere we looked at earlier. So worm bins mimic both the detritosphere and the drillosphere. These are examples of native worms that are epigeic and do well in a worm bin. If you decide to find your own worms, only select the ones that you find living in the leaves and duff on the surface of the soil. The easiest way to acquire these worms for your worm bin is to purchase them from one of the several sources that sells them locally. Like any pet, earthworms and worm bins require some attention. These are the things that you need to watch for and keep in mind if you're going to have a worm bin. An important thing to keep in mind is how much compost material you will be generating. If it's a lot, you might need more than one worm bin. If you don't generate much, don't start out with more worms than you can feed. We found that wheat and barley straw can easily become oversaturated and moldy. So shredded newspaper, rice straw, or pine bedding are the best to fill the bulk of the material in the worm bins. With a little practice, worm bins can be a lot of fun, especially for kids. And worms are a lot quieter and less trouble than most pets. There are a lot of different styles of worm bins, ranging from pricey to simple. The main difference is how easy they are to manage. Because the bins need good ventilation and space for drainage of any excess moisture, they need to be elevated above a tray to allow this drainage and circulation. Worm bins generally have screened bottoms of some kind. The holes in the screens are small enough to keep the finished castings in the bin, but large enough for the worms to get through. When the bin is full, you just place an empty bin with some straw, shredded paper, and a nice meal in the top bin. The worms in the full bin will move up into the new bin all by themselves. Once the worms have moved into the new bin, you just lift it off and you're ready to use the castings in the bin below to feed your garden or houseplants. You don't have to worry about burning or overfeeding your plants because the castings will hold onto the nutrients until your plants are ready for them. This book by Mary Applehoff has been guiding people into successful vermiculture for more than a generation. Lasagna or sheet composting is probably the easiest and most effective method for composting there is. It's a great way of taking a site and turning it into a garden without ever even turning the soil. The best time to start a lasagna site is in late summer. You can start by stockpiling the materials you need ahead of time. These include leaves, hedge trimmings, manure, wheat and barley straw. Once again, never use grass hay. It is full of weed seeds. A great way to start is to mow an area where you want to build the pile as close to the ground as possible. And the taller the weeds or grass, the better. Then you water the area with the cut down weeds and grass still in place. And once the area is well watered, cover the area with black plastic and weigh it down with the materials that you're collecting to build the pile. Leave the plastic in place until fall, till just before winter rains begin. This eliminates the need for covering the ground with cardboard to try to kill off the materials that were growing there before. When you're ready to begin building the pile, set the accumulated materials aside and remove the plastic, and then water the site very well once again. Begin by placing the woodiest debris like hedge trippings, orchard trimmings, sawdust, wood chips, old bark mulch directly on the soil surface. If you have a garden, spent tomato plants and squash and melon vines and bean vines, everything that needs to come out of the garden to prepare for winter should go on next. If you have fresh lawn clippings, add them as layers between layers of dried leaves. If you have leftover organic amendments like kelp meal, blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, Add a little to each as you build each layer. If you have compost pile or access to compost, sprinkle it in over each layer as well. Once all the materials you stockpiled are on the pile, you can collect and add leaves as they become available through the fall. If feasible, once the fall rains have wet the pile well, place the black plastic over the area and secure it from the wind. This last step is optional, but it keeps the material from blowing away and dramatically increases the rate that it decomposes. In spring, once the soil is warm enough to plant in, remove the plastic and reveal the results below. I usually plant a cover crop, a mix of buckwheat, field pea, vetch, into the freshly exposed soil. This starts the process of building the soil biology and adds nutrients to the soil in the new beds. It also allows you to see if any troublesome weeds are going to come up before you invest the time and energy in planting a food or ornamental crop. If any grasses come up, pull them immediately. When anything in the new bed that you planted starts to flower, especially the weeds, cut down everything that's flowering in the bed. A string trimmer, of course, is the easiest way to do this. And then cover the area once again with black plastic and leave the plastic on until everything is decomposed, leaving a layer of rich, fluffy, worm-filled soil ready to plant. The final type of composting we'll look at is the one that we use here on our research and teaching farm. This technique integrates all of the methods we've looked at before into one nutrient cycling system. This method has the advantage of returning nutrients back into the soil directly to the place where they were removed during plant growth. These walkways are 18 inches wide, and the crop beds on either side are 4 feet wide. The composting system we use is located under the black fabric that forms the walkways between the crops that you see in this picture. This system engages all of the zones of soil biology to decompose the plant materials. This retains the nutrients contained in the plants, including the nitrogen and carbon that's lost in the other techniques. In this diagram, you see the walkways between the crop beds that shows the layer of wood chips that cover the composting sites below, shaded in green, labeled detritosphere. They use many of the same facultative anaerobes that you would find in a bokashi system. In this system, the moisture and nitrogen that are lost in the hot and cold compost piles keeps them underground and transmits them along with all of the rest of the nutrients directly into the plant root zone that's less than 2 feet away. This transmission is carried out by earthworms and other organisms living in the walls of the composting zone. So worm bins form the walls of that compost zone. The worm castings are deposited directly into the root zone, the rhizosphere, of the plants in the cropping beds. The carbon left behind during composting goes directly in the soil and not into the atmosphere. Fungi and the wood chips seal the system off from the atmosphere, and the fabric above keeps the wood chips and fungi dark and cool, like a floor of an old-growth forest. The microbes in the compost zone are so efficient, and the distance to the plant roots is so short that within a matter of weeks, the nutrients in the compost are back in the root zone. And the soil between the walkways and the crop beds is composed mainly of earthworm castings. It looks like dark brown cottage cheese. At the end of the growing season, as soon as the last of the crops are harvested, the crop debris goes into the walkway right next to where the plant was growing. The compost materials never leave the field, saving a lot of time and energy in transporting materials to and from a compost pile. This system works just as fast as a hot pile, but doesn't require tracking the temperature or turning the compost. When we did track the temperature in the walkway, we found that the temperatures there got above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, especially if the crop debris contains a lot of unripe produce. As soon as the crop debris is put in the walkway, it's covered with wood chips and the black fabric. This method of composting is far less work than any of the other methods and provides for all the habitats found naturally in a healthy soil. In winter, we grow fava beans to add nitrogen to the soil in the cropping beds and leave the rhizosphere productive and well fed. The canopy from the crops protect the soil from compaction by rain and protects the mulch below from wind and cold overnight temperatures. In the spring, we harvest the tender stalks and leaves and flowers of the fava beans and place them into the hungry walkways, leaving the stubble and roots of the cover crop in the cropping beds. This feeds the cropping beds both from the surface and directly into the root zone underground through the trenches. The walkways allow access into the cropping beds for planting and harvest. The wood chips and the walkways distribute the impact of traffic on the walkways, eliminating compaction as an issue to soil management. A new flush of nitrogen and other nutrients pulses into the cropping beds just as the next year crops need it. This cycle goes on year after year, and the soil in the cropping bed increases in depth by 2 or 3 inches every year. Now, people often ask about adding wood ash to compost or garden soils. Softwood ash contains sodium, which can cause problems in the soil. So it's best to avoid adding ash from conifer or poplar wood. If hardwood ash is used, be sure to monitor the pH and potassium content of the soil to avoid getting these components of soil chemistry out of balance. So here's a review of some of the important takeaways regarding composting methods that we've looked at. With an understanding of what's involved with each method and what results you can expect from each system, we hope that you can make an informed choice on which method will meet your needs and fit your lifestyle. We hope this will guide you into taking on your role in the soil food web. These are some other things to keep in mind to keep your soil healthy. Avoid disturbance of the soil. Avoiding the disturbance of the soil will help keep the soil food web intact. We found that cutting down weeds before they flower and covering them with an occultation or cover material that keeps them in the dark is a better way of controlling weeds than tilling the soil. Plant cover crops on the soil that isn't planted in vegetable crops, shades out the weeds, keeps the rhizosphere active. Cutting down cover crops and using them as a mulch to protect the soil or feeding them to your compost incorporates the nutrients that they contain back into the soil. Mulches keep the soil surface from drying out or from being compacted by raindrops and provides nutrients for a healthy detritosphere. This goes a long way toward nurturing the soil food web. As we've seen, composting is a great way to return the nutrients locked up in biomass back into the soil. And rotating crops in your planting bed helps keep pests and disease from getting a foothold and varies the nutrient demands from season to season. So that completes our presentation, and I'll entertain any questions.
Hi, thank you, Scott, for that. That was fascinating. Excuse me. I had no idea how little I knew about composting. All righty. Participants are encouraged to add questions to the chat feature, but if you would prefer to ask your question verbally, go ahead and unmute yourself. We'll just kind of juggle the two. Does anyone have any questions yet?
Could we take down the sharing and so we can see each other?
Oh, yes, my apologies. There, did that work?
Yes, thank you
I
very
see.
much.
Okay.
Well, I'll start by asking just a very, I've been in Master Gardener program for 10 years, so this should be a very stupid question. But anyway, I have the 4 raised beds. I think, Scott, you've probably seen them before. And my soil just appears to be dead. And I know you said to plant the cover crop and put the black tarp over it and, then just mow it down and work it into the soil after it comes. And I think last year or the year before is when I did that. Just thought I was doing it just the way you said, and but my soil just didn't seem to have any worms. So I went and I bought the worm castings, and I put worm castings in, and then planted my plants. And I don't know, the plants do all right, but they're not a thriving type plant like you would expect. They don't look like the ones in your picture, along your beds. So I'm trying to think, like if I go to the Grange and I buy the compost in the bag, and I don't do my own composting, but I buy it in the bag and I put that in, how beneficial is that compost to my gardens?
Okay, it depends on the compost.
Okay.
If that compost has woody debris, like shreds of bark and so forth in it, then you're actually taking a step back in the soil, because all of that material is going to have to decompose before it's real compost. And when that happens, it'll suck up all the nitrogen and a lot of the oxygen out of the soil. So that's why you have to be very careful about adding a compost and make sure that it looks like rich, crumbly, forest floor soil. So my other question is, what cover crops are you putting in?
I think the beans, the
Fava beans?
fava beans, whatever, and I put that on. And there was something else that you suggested, I think, that I planted too. I can't remember what it was. And I don't, maybe it's just my time frame, in the way I do this. And it could be my watering cycle. Maybe there needs to be more water on all that before I do anything.
What time of the year do you plant the fava beans?
Well, in the past, when I did that, I didn't do it this last year at all, but in the past I planted them like in the fall.
Good. Well, that's the best time for one thing, because nature will water it for you and you don't have to worry about that.
Right.
And then the best thing to do is to just cut them down, all the material, don't till them in, just leave them laying as a mulch on top of the soil, and then cover that so that the birds won't come and eat up all the worms and so forth. And leave them there until they've completely decomposed. And then normally what happens when you do that is that gives something for all the worms, to eat. Now, it's possible that because they're raised beds, that maybe the worms aren't doing that well in the bed, because with a raised bed, you have a difficult time, particularly in the winter, controlling the temperature in the soil of those beds. So they can get cold. And that can slow things down. So those are some of the things that you have to watch for in raised beds. The other thing is just dig down and look into the soil that's there, and look and see how dense the actual mineral soils are. If they look really dense, then in addition to planting the fava beans, those bring nitrogen into the soil and nutrients. But if you need to build the organic matter down in the soil, the best thing to do is to grow daikon, big round radishes. They'll put
Okay.
this huge root down into the soil, and you just let them grow up. And then in the spring, then you take them, and what I do is take a weed whacker and I just splatter them all over the surface of the soil. And that gives you a nice mulch on top. But the important thing is now you have this nice column of organic matter that goes down into the soil. And most of the time, if there are any worms in there, they will come in and fill in that network in the daikon radish and just feed like crazy.
Oh,
So
boy,
that's one possibility.
that would just be wonderful. And then, you suggested many years ago to me using rice straw.
Right.
And so I've used rice straw, and I think everything stays more, what I want to say, more consistent or whatever by having that rice straw put over everything below my plants and everything, especially in my strawberries. But
Right.
that rice straw then kind of helps with my watering, I think, because I don't have automatic watering. I just lay out those little hoses, in my beds, and then I turn them on for a certain amount of time. But I think that helps with a lot of things, that rice straw too. So I
That's
thought,
nice because with other cereal straws, you can get a mat. They're very waxy. And so it causes a mat, and they just end up rotting and causing this kind of anaerobic layer. But rice straw stays fluffy.
yes.
It allows moisture to come through, and it felts so nicely that. And the other thing about the other straws is you get a good wind, they're gone. But that rice straw will pretty well stay there. And up where you are, you get some pretty good wind.
Yeah. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll let somebody else ask questions. I don't want to take too much time. But
Well, Pam,
also,
do you mind if I kind of divert to some of the other questions that are being posted online right now?
yeah, do
That'd be
that.
okay? There might be some of the similar questions.
Okay.
Scott, there were a couple of people who were concerned about the use of plastics in soil. How do you respond to that?
I wish there was an alternative. I'm working really, really hard with hemp growers to start making hemp tarping materials. Now, I've gone all the way to New Hampshire to find people that will help with this. If you think about it, for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, they used hemp to make sails to drive ships. And they would make the perfect cover material. But up until now, we're sort of stuck with the plastics. And I really dislike that. And the other thing is that particularly if you're using black plastic sheeting, 6 mil sheeting, you have to be on top of it and get that taken off and put away before it starts to deteriorate, because it leaves a huge mess. And I agree, it's a travesty that that's what we're stuck with. But for now the weed barrier, woven weed barrier mats don't have nearly that problem. Ours we've had in place for a decade, I think, and they're still in pretty good shape. And they don't really break down into those shards the way the others do. And I hate that's what we're left with. But the advantages of doing that occultation, of covering stuff, it's such a powerful tool that I have a hard time leaving it behind. So I agree, plastics are not the solution, but that's what we're stuck with right now.
Now, Melinda followed up asking, is cardboard a decent substitute for plastic?
Well, the thing is, you have to keep it wet or else it blows away. And when it dries out, the corners kind of curl up and so forth. So if you put the cardboard down and then maybe put straw on top of that to help keep it wet, it works pretty well. The other thing is that the glues that are in cardboard, and particularly if it's a waxy cardboard, those are an even bigger problem than the plastics, because there's some pretty gnarly, chemicals in those. So if you can find a nice organic cardboard, go for it.
And just to follow up, Melinda had another question. In terms, I believe this is for composting materials, but what would you recommend for store-bought compost? I know Pam kind of brought this up earlier.
I'm sorry, I have not found any compost that's commercially available that I really like. And the reason is it's never finished compost. It's all full of wood chips or, undecomposed material. And the problem is, like I said, if you put that into a soil, it's going to continue to decompose. It's going to rob that soil of nitrogen and oxygen. And you have to wait until it has completely finished before that ceases to be a problem. And so far, I haven't seen a compost that it, has accomplished that. And the reason is because it just takes a lot longer for the compost to reach a finished stage. And I think most commercial operations, have a time frame that is economical for them. And so if you find a compost that is nice, fluffy, completely composted material, go for it. That would be great. But you just have to look at it, see what you're getting, and then make the determination. So,
Okay, I have a couple questions from Autumn too, although I'm going to do them backwards. First, she asked, we have a tiny yard and no available wood products to add to our compost. What do you suggest is the best source or type we could gather?
well, I mean, if you can get a hold of leaves, in the fall, there are lots and lots and lots of bags of leaves. And if you have neighbors that you can, go to and say, hey, I'll take those right off your hands, don't put them out by the street. And as long as they don't have pesticides or herbicides or something in them, that's a wonderful, wonderful source.
I've had a neighbor ask me for my leaves, so.
Right. Now, the thing you have to watch out for are poplar leaves, like cottonwood and stuff like that. That waxy material that's on there, they don't decompose, they rot. And they make a huge mess. So the best leaves that are out there, nice oak, maple are by far the best leaves out there, the most nutrient rich. They break down nicely. But poplar leaves, they're not worth the effort. They really aren't. And now, frankly, the best leaf out there is a pecan leaf. They have so much zinc in them. They're such good, but pecans are pretty rare in this part of the country. One of the issues about particularly black walnut, they have allelopaths in the walnut in the leaves themselves. Now, those allelopaths are completely decomposed if the leaves are thoroughly if they end up brown, crumbly soil looking stuff, those allelopaths are pretty much completely decomposed. But if there's still leafy material in there, then there's a good chance those allelopaths, and allelopaths are generated by a plant to limit other plants from coming up around them. They stop other plants from germinating. So as long as you compost them well, and my understanding is that English walnuts have far less of that material in them than black walnut. But I have composted black walnut seeds leaves until they were completely gone, and I never had a problem with them. So those are the caveats on leaves.
I have a question. This is Margaret. Hi.
Hi, Margaret.
I have a question about vermiculture. I started a worm bin and I don't really know how much moisture to add. Like with shredded, like with paper bags or newspaper, can I just put them in, or do I need to soak them?
You don't need to soak them.
Just mist them or something?
Mist them, because if they're too wet, it's a mess.
Yeah,
And if they're
yeah.
too dry, then the worms desiccate. So
Okay, I think I'm doing all right. Yeah.
And all it is practice. It's like anything, you'll learn once you get the rhythm of it. It's really pretty straightforward, but and depending on, shopping bags are completely different than shredded newspaper. They take different amounts of moisture. But what you want is the moisture you would find in a nice, normal forest for soil. So
Okay.
not too wet, not too dry.
Autumn had a question about worms too. She was wondering, is it dangerous to keep worms in such a cool climate? What happens when it's colder than 50 degrees?
Well, they slow down is really what it comes down to. For one thing, they don't breed. They just become quiescent. And then pretty soon they die because they haven't had any offspring. So you really need to keep it between 50 degrees and 80 degrees is really about as warm as you would want to get a worm bin. So, that's one of the issues around worm bins is they need to be cozy.
Okay. And someone shared earlier that I've had good luck with Barnyard Blend, which is composted manure, and that's sold at the Grange Co-op.
Okay.
And then someone else has chimed in. Any advice to those of us starting from scratch? Simple, where to start? Small yard, raised beds.
Okay. What is that, to start making compost or?
Erin, can you expand on that?
Yeah.
Erin, you're muted.
Okay, well, we're waiting for Erin to respond.
Here,
Oh,
I'm sorry.
yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks.
Oh,
Yes, just lots going on, work, kids, a lot of sports, blah blah blah. Trying to compost. I mean, I got one of these that you spin, and of course, it's just not really breaking down.
Right.
And I had to keep a dog out of it. But all of that. But I really don't want to throw my compost away, and I have access to leaves and all. We have lots of leaves and sticks and all that. um but is there any way, like if I get like a raised bed that I can make, just layer it in? Is that what you would do, the lasagna
Sure.
that way,
Sure.
with just like kind of modify a bit that last lasagna one? Is that
Sure, that'll work. Now, the only issue is as long as you don't have rodents or anything, raccoons or anything like that to, dig it up, then it's
uh-huh
really not a problem. Now, what I do with my kitchen waste is I just go out, I have a corner of my yard that I'm not really using for anything else. And all I do is dig a trench and take the bucket of compost and throw in a little bit of uh, pine bedding that you get from the co-op or someplace, and mix it in to where there's enough of the bedding to make sure that what goes in there isn't just juicy, to absorb that, and then bury it. I mean,
okay.
just flat bury it. And
Y-
as long as you're not planning to use that bed for anything, immediate, that's a very easy way to do it. So
So
that's
you
one option.
plant a trench, throw your kitchen compost in, cover it with pine bedding, and you don't spin it or you don't
No,
turn it, and
no,
then you just cover it or leave it open,
just bury it.
bury it.
Just
Okay.
cover it. And as long as you're not planning on doing anything with that bed for, 6 months or something, actually it takes less time than that, it goes away. And what you'll end up with is a little bed there that's absolutely full of worms. Now you can
Huh.
do the same thing in a raised bed,
Uh-huh.
as long as it's not too cold and, you know, um, and the soils are adequate for, hosting the biology. So like if you have a hard clay or something like that,
Yes,
it,
lots of hard, horrible soil. So
right. But the thing about it is, if you dig a trench in that, even in that clay, as the critical thing is, composting happens because of the critters that are living And so if you put it in a plastic box that's way above the soil, where the temperature varies hugely just, through the day, there's no way for the critters that break down that material to get into that. And so what happens is the critters that you don't want in there, the stinky ones and the fly larvae, that's what ends up in one of those boxes.
Mhm.
But the soil is full of the critters that you rely upon in order to decompose that material. So that's a very, very easy way of actually, decomposing it. And as long as you don't
Thank
have
you.
raccoons that'll dig it up, you're in good shape.
Thank you.
So I have a question about when you say bury it, how deep are we talking about to keep, things like rats and that sort of thing out of it?
Yeah. Well, 6 or 8 inches easily. That's really, and now we live in the country where rats aren't really a problem. So, it might be different, in an urban setting where, anything might be out there. But yeah, 6 or 8 inches is all we do. And the thing is, within 6 months for sure, everything that you put in that trench will be gone, and you can dig up exactly the same trench. It'll all be gone. You just dig up the same place. So you don't have to have an endless length of material of space to do it. So
I got a question. So do you?
Melinda had another question. She says, I have just been burying my chicken poop in relatively unused areas since it's caustic at first. Is this a health hazard?
Well, the question is, are you going to grow food crops in it afterwards? And the Oregon Tilth recommendations are that if you use a manure, it needs to get up to 131 degrees for at least 3 days for the pathogens to go away. And that's not happening in the soil. But if you're, growing ornamentals or something like that in there, it's not going to hurt anything. So, that would be okay. Now, it might be that there are pathogens in there, so you might not want to, once you get things planted, they should probably stay there. But and there's no guarantee that there's going to be a pathogen in there anyway. Although right now with bird flu as an issue, I'd be very, very careful about poultry wastes, just in case.
Pam, are you still with us? Did you have any more questions?
I don't see her in the
I
list.
think she had to leave.
Mhm.
All right. Sure she knows how to get a hold of you in the future.
Oh yeah.
All right. Any more questions before we wrap this up? All righty. Oh, Melinda says, good point. So helpful. Thanks.
Great.
All righty. And well,
Well, this has
thank
been
you,
delightful.
Scott, for all of this valuable information. Again, he is a Master Gardener and part of SOU Extension's Master Gardener program.
Mhm.
And sounds like a fantastic group to be a part of.